For this tutorial, we're going to look at the main purpose of what we're trying to achieve in our module called Narratives That Shape Our World. And I suppose what we have to do is we have to, we're looking at narratives that shape our identity. And so we have to look at what is the role of fiction? What is its purpose? So one function of fiction is to challenge the dominant narrative of our society. Now, our texts, Jasper Jones and What's Eating Gilbert Grape, they're set in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the dominant narrative for Western society in the 1950s and 1960s consisted of things like the importance of the nuclear family, the male roles and female roles were divided into the role of breadwinner and the role of educator on the home front, the idea of raising children. So one was certainly a public domain and one was the private domain. So you have these two worlds operating side by side. Society was very conservative, and the impression was that society functioned very smoothly and all was well with the world because people were good and everyone was happy. That's the main story that's presented of the 1950s and 60s. So Jasper Jones, the novel, presents a different view of the 1960s Australian society. And Sylvie stated that he was really disputing the view that the 1960s was a watershed moment in our history when we grew up as a nation. And he presents stories of the marginalised to strike up a conversation about the reality of life in Australia in the 1960s. So what we have to look at is this idea of marginalisation. So, well, who is it that, who are the marginalised in the novel? So we can look at the non-macho style boys that don't fit the normal male role, and that being of Charlie and Jeffrey predominantly. We can look at women as being marginalised in the novel. So there are many, and basically all women presented are presented in that role, in that position. Laura Wishart is one example that we meet very early in the novel, and I think Laura's mother is a really interesting example of a marginalised female because of that. We come to learn that she turns a blind eye to her husband's actions, and that's due to her feeling of powerlessness, I suppose. Indigenous Australians are certainly marginalised, and we trace the story of Jasper and the treatment that he receives. And there are those who are misunderstood in society who live on the fringes. Mad Jack Lionel is certainly a person that fits that role. So essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about the marginalised are those without power. So Sylvie allows the marginalised to tell their stories as a means of correcting the misinterpretation of them. So Mad Jack Lionel is a classic example of this. His story is a good example. And the townsfolk view him as a threat, and they label him as a murderer with no hard evidence. And he's certainly one to be avoided. But when he's given a voice, we're able to get closer to the truth. And this allows us to consider the prejudice that is evident in the towns throughout Australia, where we've got prejudice over here. So we've moved from power to prejudice, and now we're moving to the next word of injustice. Following this example is Jasper Jones, and he's subject to all kinds of injustice because of his Aboriginality. He's accused of all crime, and he's shunned from the adults by the adults of the town. And the police abuse their power against him, and they try and beat a confession out of Jasper. And this example suggests that something's wrong with the fabric of society and the dominant of the 1960s Australia, because those with power and those in the public eye abuse their positions of trust. And so that's certainly something that is central to the exploration of the main concerns of the novel. A really important word is this next one, discourse. Okay, And really, the novel Jasper Jones engages in a discourse about the Australian narrative. Discourse basically means that we engage in a conversation. So the novel reignites the conversation about how we perceive 1960s Australia. Then what we can do is we can apply this to our present day. We can ask questions as to whether Australia's grown up, or do we still experience racism, sexism, abuse of power, and do we have issues with things such as alcohol? So this discourse is a conversation that is ongoing, and in this case, just in the case of the novel, this discourse has spanned over half a century. So it's an interesting sort of concept. Now, stories of the marginalised are important in our world. These narratives provide an opportunity to correct social injustices, and it's as a means of reshaping our identity. So really what it is it's a reflective process. And now I suppose what we need to do is turn our attention to this term postmodernism. And postmodernists believe that all stories have been told before. So what Sylvie does is he tells another story about life in Australia in the 1960s, but he changes the narrative. He focuses the story on the perspective of the marginalised, those without power, and it puts us as the reader in a different headspace, and it challenges us to make our own mind up about the injustice that is easy to overlook in the dominant, or in the dominant narrative, or we could call it the grand narrative of Australian history. The novel is told through the voice of Charlie, and this traces his development from youthful innocence into an unfair world. And we experience his development of understanding and his development of a conviction to stand up for his morals. And this resonates with us. Our experience of our experience of the narratives in the novel add to our own personal narrative. So we reassess our morals and our views about prejudice and discrimination and abuse of power, and then we process that and reformulate. It might consolidate what we're thinking, or it might expand our views on that. Now, why do we read these stories? Now, we read these stories because we enjoy reading stories of the marginalised, from those who struggle against the dominant power. We like to see them have moral victories. They might not defeat the injustice in their world, but they make a stand against it. And this provides some hope for us in our world. Now, down the bottom here, I've just represented these 2 points that I made throughout the discussion, and that is that narratives provide the opportunity to correct social injustices. It's a means of reshaping our identity, and that's really, I think, the main lens and the main sort of thesis statement that we want to explore in our preparation for the speech that we've got. The second point there is that stories of the marginalised are important in our world. And what you need to be able to do is say, why is it that they're important? Why shouldn't we just have a single narrative? Why is it important that we do gain exposure to stories from different aspects and from different voices? That I'm sure you'll be able to do quite comfortably. And there are lots of words that are presented on the page here that you can use to form that justification as to why these stories are important in the world. And then all we're going to do is illustrate it with a few examples from the novel. So we'll keep exploring aspects of the novel, and then what we'll do is we'll make comparisons to the film that we're going to study.